for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Talk Now Radio, listener-supported radio where no topic is taboo. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Frank Joseph, who is, he's been on my show several times now. He's always a fantastic guest. I've read some of his books. He really writes some very in-depth and very important work on ancient America and different facets of it. And, you know, he's uncovered quite a bit of evidence through the years that Christopher Columbus was far from being the discoverer of America, not even near to it. He was just basically pretty much the first one that history recorded. Now, me and him, I think both of us would agree that it's kind of hard to fathom why they wouldn't correct the history books when they found more archaeological finds. But as many of his books show, all of America is just flat littered with artifacts from all around the world, from different cultures. So you know that they were visiting. I think some of his books even show that they even started fresh cultures. I even read a book by Richard Dewhouse, folks, once that talked about giants in ancient America. And some of these, from what I was reading of it in the book, it kind of struck me as being the Aryans from over at the, Near East or Middle East area that, try to invade, I think it was, Hindu, or, I'm not real good geographically, but I'm sure Frank here knows the area I'm talking about. But there's a long list about that. They were associated with Atlantis, by some people, but, pretty much basically just more evidence right there of the contact between the old world and the new world that's been ongoing for many years. So I'm going to let Frank go a little bit more into detail on that. But real quick, I want to let everybody know if you got any questions, feel free to call 832-632-7904. Don't forget my new URL is www.talknowradio.net. Please feel free to invite your friends. And don't forget, when you click on links on their site, the affiliate links anyway, you help support and keep us on the air. And you keep us sponsor free. So, because when a station has sponsors, if sponsors don't like your material, they can pull out on you. And it kind of limits what you can broadcast if you want to stay on the air. So any help that listeners give helps keep that from happening. So Frank, how are you doing tonight?
Well, Royce, I'm feeling fine to be on your show again. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Frank. I'm really grateful to have you back. Actually, I always look forward to having you, and I kind of keep plugged into when you have a new book coming out so I can call you and ask you. So that's
one way where you can get yourself a complimentary copy. Just invite me on your show.
Well, hey, if it works, why would I turn something like that down?
Yes.
Now, this latest book, and I actually got it right out here in front of me. I got it upside down, but I got it in front of me. The Lost Colonies of Ancient America. You've done a lot of research put into this here book in order to list, and when you were talking about this while we were waiting for the show to start, to list all the artifacts that were found from all these different places. I mean, you got like at least 12, 13, if you include Christians, 14 chapters or 14 groups that have visited America before Christopher Columbus and have left their mark here. So you must have spent a lot of time. You got a real passion for this, don't you?
Well, I've been studying this, Royce, for going on 40 years now. And this book was a particularly interesting project for me because I had no intention of writing it. I was contacted by my publisher at New Page Books, and he said, there are a number of books out about different peoples arriving in America before Columbus, but none of the books so far gives an overall view of all of the peoples that supposedly arrived in America before Columbus. So why don't you do this, he said. Why don't you write a book in which each chapter is devoted to one of these peoples that arrived before Columbus, And I don't want you to put in all the information on them because that would run into many volumes. What you do is you put in the best, what you think is the most persuasive evidence that would show that the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and these pre-Christian, or rather these Christians before Columbus, that they arrived here, and show the best information you can get. So I figured, well, that sounds kind of interesting, and I had to rely upon the material that I'd been collecting for decades before. But I have to tell you, Royce, it was only when I was putting this book together that the whole panorama of all these peoples arriving here in the Americas really became clear to me for the first time. I'd studied them up close. I'd been collecting a lot of information about it. I've traveled around the world several times myself. I was the editor of Ancient American magazine for 14 years. We collected, material from all over the world for that. But it was only in writing this book where I would put together the best, most persuasive evidence for each particular people that the whole drama of pre-Columbian America really opened up for me. And I decided, well, I've got to write this book for average readers like myself. I'd stay away from the technical aspects of it and just try to show exactly what happened. This book is written for people who don't have any particular theories. Certainly I had no theories at all. They're written for people who are just interested in the truth, what really happened. Not what people tell them what happened, but really, what does the evidence show? And the evidence shows that the ancient Egyptians came here specifically for very important things, and as did the Sumerians before them, and the Phoenicians and the Romans after them. It's a terrific story. It's a great drama, and it belongs to all of us. And I think that it's important for us to understand the real origins of our country.
Yeah, no doubt. And he used to say that some of the Native Americans aren't just offshoots of those visitors that stayed behind and, started their own kind of like colonies or tribes.
Well, the Native Americans, they were among the earliest peoples. They were not the first. What we call Native Americans today are descended from Siberians who crossed over a land bridge that connected Asia to Alaska about 15,000 years ago. They crossed over this bridge, and they stayed mostly in Alaska and northern Canada for a long time, for many centuries. And it was only really about 12 or 13,000 years ago that they filtered down into what is now the continental United States to become the ancestors of most Native American tribes. But they are not the only pre-Columbian people who arrived here. They were preceded by other peoples, and they were followed by others from all over the world, not just Western Europe or from Asia, but also from West Africa and the Near East as well. I have a whole chapter on West Africans and their tremendous impact that they had on the Americas, and some really persuasive physical hard evidence, not just theories. And I guess America has always been a melting pot long before the Statue of Liberty was erected. And people came here for different reasons. The ancient Egyptians, for example, they came here for two very specific items that they could obtain no place else. And the first thing they wanted was from South America, which was cocaine. They came for the cocaine. And they didn't use cocaine as a recreational drug. Back in 1991, when these curators at the Cairo Museum were renovating mummies, fixing them up, as it were, because they were deteriorating a little bit, they were surprised, more than surprised, to find traces of cocaine in these mummies. Now, cocaine has never grown in the Nile Valley. It does not grow there. It has not grown in Africa or the ancient Old World. Cocaine only grows in northern Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. No place else. The cocaine that was found in these Egyptian mummies, in fact, came from South America. And when the archaeologists expanded their investigation of this surprising trace element, they found that cocaine was in evidence in literally dozens, possibly now hundreds of mummies that go back to the earliest dynasties. and that the mummies were not all of pharaohs or kings or royalty. They were men, women, and children of all social classes. Well, how could this be? Why would anybody be interested in such large amounts of cocaine? That discovery solves an earlier mystery. That earlier mystery was the ancient Egyptian physicians were noted for being tremendous brain surgeons. This is thousands of years ago, very successful brain surgeons. We know that because the mummies who show that they had brain surgery while alive, their incisions healed perfectly. So the vast majority, 85 to 95% of those patients who had brain surgery in ancient Egypt survived. The Egyptian doctors were also superb eye surgeons. And the question was always, well, how on earth could these Egyptian doctors have administered to their patients brain surgery and eye surgery without the use of anesthesia? There was no evidence that they had used any anesthesia. How was that possible? So that was a mystery for a long while. Well, the discovery of cocaine shows that what the ancient apothecaries did is that they mixed up cocaine with some other herbs and other ingredients that are not well understood, but cocaine was the basis for this anesthesia that was used by Egyptian medical practitioners. And that is why they came to South America for something very specific. They came to North America for corn. And this was a discovery that was made not too long ago, only about 6 or 7 years ago, by Dr. Gunnar Thompson. He's a university-trained archaeologist from the University of Illinois. And when he was visiting Egypt, one of the temples in Upper Egypt that belonged to a very famous woman, her name was Queen Hatshepsut, and she ruled Egypt 3,500 years ago. And she sent an expedition that went around Africa and elsewhere. And this expedition came back and had all kinds of goods that were brought back to Egypt. And to celebrate that successful expedition, it was a commercial enterprise, took 3 years. She built this wonderful temple. And on the sides of the temple, in the Nile Valley, are these depictions of some of the goods that were brought back. And Dr. Thompson noticed that this one portrayal of a stevedore carrying a tray that is piled high with what looked like corn, like North American corn. He is not a paleobotanist, so he had to confer with those who were experts in this and were able to determine that, in fact, the breed of corn portrayed at Queen Hatshepsut's temple is in fact a variant of North American maize or corn that does not appear anywhere else in the world. So the ancient Egyptians came for cocaine as part of their medical practices, very important, and they came to North America to supplement their irregular growing season. The Nile Valley is very productive, but sometimes the weather is unpredictable, and there were famines from time to time in ancient Egypt because they based their agriculture entirely on the Nile River.
Right.
It was not always predictable. Mostly it was, but it went through some difficult times. So they supplemented their diet with corn that was brought back from North America. Now, this is not theory. This is hard, solid evidence. It's physical evidence, and there's no other interpretation of this evidence. And it indicates the Egyptians were here for a long time and took back the cocaine and the corn. Well, why don't we know about this? Why has this only been found recently? That's because the ancient Egyptians were like all the other peoples that arrived here before Columbus. They kept their voyage here secret because they wanted monopolies on the minerals and the other natural treasures that they found here. The ancient kingdoms that came here were very similar to today's industries and corporations. We know of a phenomenon known as industrial espionage.
Right. Now I was reading that in your book.
One corporation will guard its secrets against another corporation. And that's exactly what the ancient kingdoms did when they came here. They didn't want other kingdoms to find out what they were bringing back, because then they'd lose their monopoly of it. And then when the ancient world fell, when Roman civilization collapsed, all this information was lost for the most part. And as a consequence, in the Dark Ages that followed the collapse of the ancient world, all knowledge of these voyages that took place was mostly forgotten. And it was up to Columbus, as part of the Renaissance, to resurrect some of the scraps of information that they had from the ancient world, and based on that he was able to make an achievement which has not been diminished by any of this. Columbus was a very great man. His achievement is fabulous. He opened up the New World. These other peoples, like the Egyptians and so on, they kept all that information secret to themselves. Well, Columbus was the exact opposite. He made it available to the rest of the world. His achievement cannot be diminished in the least by these peoples that preceded him, but it's seen now in a new light.
Right. Now, what you're saying, I think, pretty well explains why, by the time Columbus got here, nobody from over in his neck of the woods knew how to raise corn anymore, because it got lost during the Dark Ages.
That's right. When a civilization falls, it's not a pretty sight. And all of the knowledge and greatness and beauty that had been piled up for so many centuries is smashed to bits and lost over time, reduced to ashes. And that's why these voyages were regarded as legendary. It was up to archaeological science to try to piece together what had happened, and that's an ongoing process that's still taking place. It's made especially difficult today because mainstream archaeologists are very, very hostile to the idea that there were any visitors from the ancient Old World in the Americas before Columbus. For conventional scholars, 1492 is a line drawn in the sand that no one was allowed to cross without being called a heretic or a madman. And it's a sorry state of affairs, but it's the truth that modern American archaeology has become more political than it is scientific today. So,
I was going to ask you about that. Why do you suppose they really care if we know that we've discovered more? Wouldn't it be a feather in their cap to announce to the world we're progressing, rather than to just sit tight and play the dogmatic role?
No, it boils down to one word: power. Knowledge is power. Archaeology is politics. History is politics. And unfortunately, the teachers of archaeology today, professors, they write the textbooks. They get the textbooks published, and then they sell them to their students year after year, generation after generation. So they have a financial investment in perpetuating this totally outdated viewpoint, this dogma. It's a matter of control. And the people that are in charge of mainstream archaeology simply have no interest in what happened before 1492 in regards to possibilities from overseas visitors being here. They just keep repeating the same old information that they've had for the last 150 years now. No one can point to any modern find that's been made by the archaeologists, because there are none. There are no finds that they are admitting. All of the finds that are being made in archaeology now are being made by mavericks and alternative scholars, mainstream archaeologists who try to buck the system or at least question it. They come under severe fire from their colleagues. Professional jealousy reaches levels of intensity that the average American can't possibly imagine, because he's not involved in these very closed circles that have seized control of American archaeology. It's not the case in other parts of the world necessarily. Just don't find this every place else. In England, they're just as fossilized as over here, but in places like Japan or Russia, in Italy, places like that, they're far more open to these questions. Especially in South America, it was really refreshing when I went to South America and got to associate with a number of archaeologists down there. And these were university-trained people, mainstream archaeologists. they were far more open to the possibilities of visitors from other parts of the world, and who regarded the oceans of the world not as barriers but as highways. And you'll find a far more enlightened point of view outside of the United States. In the United States, it's extremely political, and a lot of vicious personal and professional rivalries, unfortunately. Archaeology in the United States is divided into two camps. The one camp that controls everything, they're called cultural isolationists. They believe that Columbus was the first and only discoverer of America, and their doctrine was promulgated by a man by the name of John Wesley Powell at the turn of the last century. John Wesley Powell tried to apply scientific criteria to archaeology, which is all very well, but in doing that, he laid down dogma. And this dogma states, he stated, I paraphrase very closely here, that any evidence, he said, which tends to show that there were visitors from the ancient old world before Columbus are to be treated, one, as either fraudulent, or two, as a misinterpretation of other evidence. So in other words, they're absolutely closed to any possibility of visitors here before Columbus. And they are not just visitors here. They're not just castaways. As the title of my book indicates, they were colonizers. They brought their civilization here. They were here for hundreds of years. And they influenced the local people. So how could they not? For good or for ill.
So they left enough evidence behind that you could tell they had definitely been there a few generations at least.
Absolutely. The evidence, Royce, is overpowering. It's overwhelming. You could fill warehouses with the evidence, which is all ignored. It is not recognized or acknowledged. It's just simply laughed away or just neglected. And instead, the archaeologists go about their same old business, saying the same things that they have said for generations now. Well, this paradigm is being shattered, I'm happy to say. Since we started our magazine, Ancient American, back in 1993, we have witnessed a change, which I'm sure we've contributed to. We can't take claim for it completely, but certainly contributed to it. And that is the progress of genetics and geology have demolished many of the foundations for this ultra-conservative point of view. And it's nice to see the archaeologists fighting amongst themselves too. There was an incident only, I think, in 2007 or 2008. I'm not so sure. Right here in the state where I am, I'm in Minnesota, and some archaeologists from the University of Minnesota were excavating the top of a high hill. Matter of fact, it's the highest point in Minnesota. It's pretty much in the north central area of Minnesota. And on top of this hill, they found a number of what they call points. These are spear points, arrowheads, things like that, common enough. And they found that there were so many that it looked as though there was a little kind of a factory that was being used here. And so it was an ordinary sort of a find, except that there were a lot of these points. Well, the archaeologists went about their business just the way they've always been trained to do, and they wanted to find out how old the site was. And lo and behold, they found out that the site, according to their own scientific criteria, was between 15 and 18,000 years old. Oh, that's a big no-no, because mainstream archaeologists say there were no human beings in Minnesota that long ago. The first human beings were in Minnesota only about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, maybe even earlier than that. But then the archaeologists who found this site said, no, we've applied the scientific criteria that you told us to use, and this site is 15 to 18,000 years. So they're now fighting each other and throwing all kinds of insults back and forth. And it's nice to see how they're sort of consuming themselves.
Mudslinging like little 5-year-olds.
So even if you're a trained, accepted archaeologist, but you say the wrong thing, you're going to get in big trouble with your colleagues, just exactly like these guys are now in trouble.
Yeah. Do you happen to know, because I read on the internet and I may have asked you this before and forgot I did, so please forgive me if I'm repeating something from the past here. But do you know if it was true what I read online, that there had been some Egyptian artifacts found in a cave way up high in the not the Rio, but the Grand Canyon?
Yes, that's an interesting story. It's a very controversial one. It's addressed not in this book that I've written. It's in an earlier book called Discovering the Mysteries of Ancient America. And it goes back to the year 1911. At that time, a nature photographer by the name of G.E. Kincaid was assigned by the Smithsonian Institution to make the first photographic record of the Grand Canyon. And so alone, in a kind of a skiff, a large rowboat, he loaded it up with his bulky camera, and he went alone down the Colorado River. And he made the first photographic record of the Grand Canyon as he had been assigned. He was a nature photographer on the same level of Ansel Adams. As a matter of fact, Ansel Adams was his teacher. And G.E. Kincaid, while he was making this photographic record of the Grand Canyon, was shocked when he came through an area which was absolutely uninhabitable. So much so that the local Apache Indians considered it taboo and never went into this area. It was very treacherous. So as far as we know, Native Americans have never even been in this part of the Grand Canyon. And in this area, G.E. Kincaid writes that he saw a broad flight of steps carved into the side of a sloping cliff. So he followed up this cliff, walked up these steps, and it led to the opening, he says, of a large cavern. He went back to his boat, returned with a lantern, and entered in this cave, this large cavern, and he found a series of rooms, a network of rooms that had all been carved out of the naked rock, and that these rooms are corridors, chambers, he said that the walls and the ceiling were completely covered with what he said were hieroglyphs. Now, G.E. Kincaid was a professional photographer, but he was not an archaeologist, and we don't know. It was some kind of writing. In one of the rooms that he found, the largest was it looked like a cafeteria. He said it resembled a cafeteria. Another was a kind of a burial crypt of some kind. But the outstanding room that he found was a chamber that stood about maybe 18 or 20 feet high. It was carved into a dome over the top, out of the rock. And at the center of this chamber was a circular altar. At the base of the altar, he describes a number of these demonic little figures as though they were dancing around the altar. And on the altar itself was a kind of a deity, an idol of some kind. He described it as having a rather Hindu-like shape, and he said its tongue was protruding from its mouth. That deity that he described could be one of two. It could be either the Egyptian god Bes, who was portrayed as a dwarf sticking his tongue out, or it could be, and probably more likely, the Hindu god Kali, which was sometimes portrayed with the tongue protruding. Kali was the goddess of death and destruction.
Could they be the same goddess in different countries?
No, I think that, the Egyptian figure, that was a male god, Bes.
Oh, okay.
He was sort of the god of merriment and entertainment. It's really quite different, whereas Kali was a goddess, a woman, female deity, and she was the divine patron of death and destruction, so it was really quite different. From his description, it would appear that it was what he had found was a site that had been built by people from Southeast Asia or from India. He made his disclosure to the local newspapers. This was in 1911. We followed up on G.E. Kincaid. We established that he really did exist. Matter of fact, I got a chance to talk to his great-grandson, so we do know that he existed. And that the Smithsonian sent an expedition to follow up on his discovery. and that the Smithsonian engineers laid a railroad track, a small railroad track, and on this track they had a number of carts which they loaded up artifacts in and completely denuded the cave, apparently, over a period of some weeks. And then they sealed the cave with a great iron gate and put a heavy chain across it. And that was the end of it. And anybody who calls the Smithsonian today will get the same response. Yes, we've heard about that, but we had nothing to do with that at all. We knew nothing about it, and that's just as a newspaper hoax. Really? Well, we found out that G.E. Kincaid, in fact, was commissioned by the Smithsonian in 1911. We also determined that the leader of the expedition to the site that he found, his name was Jordan, that he was, in fact, a functionary in the Smithsonian up until about 1924. So they are either just lying or they just forgot or who knows what, but they will admit nothing about this find. And if you go there today, to this day, it's difficult to find, but it can be found. Now, you break the law because the regulations for the Grand Canyon, the federal regulations, of course, is that no one is allowed in that area to this day. And if you go in there, you will be escorted out. And that has happened. The last time that we spoke with anybody that had been there was about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a husband and wife team. They did find the site. They did find the cavern with its iron gate and its heavy chain, and they did see the steps. And before they could do much more, a helicopter appeared out of nowhere and told them they had to get out of the area immediately or face arrest. Interesting.
Sounds like an awful lot of expense to guard the cave, especially after they got rid of everything in it.
Well, apparently, I assume that the cave might have been cleaned out, but the hieroglyphs are still.
They don't want anybody being able to read those hieroglyphs.
No, they don't want it, and it's obviously a man-made site. So I think that what we're looking at, what we would like to look at, is probably evidence for culture bearers from Southeast Asia that arrived there. Now, this is not as far-fetched as it seems. I mean, good Lord, all the way from Southeast Asia to the Grand Canyon. There is a wonderful report, which I was able to quote from at some length in my book on what we're talking about here, Lost Colonies of Ancient America. There's a chapter about ancient China and how the Chinese made it to the Grand Canyon, and they described the Grand Canyon, and they described the whole area really quite well. And this was, of course, something like about 1,000 years before Columbus was even born. So we've got some really interesting parallels about the Grand Canyon, but no one's been able to go back to that site today without permission of the federal government, and there's no way you're going to get that.
Yeah, and I find it kind of interesting that they would have a helicopter on a 24-hour call, but
just about. I mean, yeah, the helicopter appeared out of nowhere. This husband and wife team, they'd only just arrived there. They'd only been there for like maybe a half hour or so. And when this helicopter arrived,
they didn't know when these people would be there, so they had to be watching it for how many years?
Either that or they've got sensors there. Who knows? Whatever it is. But yeah, this helicopter showed up and flew real low over them, and they had a loudspeaker on saying that, you're violating federal property, blah, blah, blah. If you don't leave immediately, you'll be arrested. And so, of course, they skedaddled out of there. But it's amazing. I mean, you do kind of laugh because, heck, this is only archaeology, right? No, apparently it means a lot to people. It means there are other really
the wrong people, no doubt.
It really does, and it's what a loss it is. I've found, Royce, that anyone who studies history to any extent realizes that history is not past. That what you are, what all of us are as individuals, are the accumulation of everything that has come from the past. You are the result of everything that's happened. And so that if that's the case, then, and it is, then history or the past is not dead. It's alive in you. And the more you learn about history in general, especially the American past, the more you feel rooted to your country, the more a sense of identification, personal identification you have. So there's, I think, a real sincerely patriotic impetus for an appreciation of history and all of the human drama that went into it. If you don't have any appreciation of history, you don't really feel that well attached, which is it's unfortunate. And the great thing about the Lost Colonies of Ancient America is that I was lucky enough. I just worked as a science reporter. I've not made these discoveries. These discoveries have been made by many other wonderful men and women. And it's been my privilege to be able to write them up and to sort of organize their material. It's always been sort of scattered here and there. But if you put it in perspective, it really is quite a rich heritage that we have. And it makes you interested in your country and where you came from.
Yeah, you'd think that a lot of people would want to know this information too, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would think so. You know, I mean, it establishes a kind of a connectiveness or a connection between you and the land that was missing before, and I think that's kind of important. It certainly enriches one's life, and history is so vitally important. It's an important subject that we should know about, because if I could deprive you of all knowledge of your own past, say for the last 2 days, you've forgotten everything else, you'd be completely at a loss how to conduct yourself now, and the future would be absolutely terrifying. But then if you know about yourself and you have your experience, your life experience behind you, then you're very much in control of yourself now. You feel very confident in your present time, and you feel self-confident about the future as well. You're not so uncertain. You feel competent in order to competent enough to handle some of these problems that are coming. But if you're deprived of all that knowledge, you're at a loss. I think that same can be said for a whole people. If you deprive a people of their history, or you replace it with some concocted fairy tale, you deprive them of a sense of place where they are now, and deprive them of a sense of self-confidence.
Yeah, and you also, in a sense, you kind of rob them of their place in history and their place where they're at. Because if they can't attach themselves to it, then does it really belong to them?
That's correct. I think that it's more important psychologically to be connected to a place than legally or any other way. If you've got that heartfelt connection with your country, that's something far more powerful than just legal documents or what they tell you to do in civics class. And that's why I think it's important to understand the past. And when we realize then that all these other peoples from Europe and from Africa and from Asia, it gives a sense of pride for everybody, because we all contributed in our own ways, for good or ill, to America's prehistory. I think it's very tremendous. I mean, we can take pride in our Viking past, our Viking ancestors here. They did great things. But then so did the Chinese. The Chinese came here and they surveyed the Grand Canyon. They're the first known human beings to make a scientific survey of the Grand Canyon. And they did this many centuries before Columbus. And then the Sumerians, they came here for their reasons. It's really fascinating stuff. Some of them did arrive as castaways, there's no doubt. Some of them arrived here because they got lost at sea, and they were separated by very difficult storms at sea and so forth, and they found refuge here. Well, that's another thing about America, of course. It's always been a place of refuge. Others arrived here not as castaways, but as refugees. I'm thinking especially of the Jews during the wars against Jerusalem. Some of
I was going to say during the diaspora.
That's correct. Absolutely. And one of the great proofs of that connects the Jews to America long ago. And that is something called the Bat Creek Stone. This is really hard evidence.
I think I read about that in one of your prior books I read.
Right. We discussed it there a little bit. But here I went into a little bit greater detail. The Bat Creek Stone was found under unimpeachable conditions. It was found in 1898 by an archaeologist who was working for the Smithsonian Institution. And this is in eastern Tennessee. he was assigned to excavate what was known as an Indian mound. It was just a low mound, nothing fancy at all. And of course, there are tens of thousands of them across the United States, and this was just like one of all the others. So he excavated this mound. It was just part of their survey of prehistory in eastern Tennessee. And when he dug into the mound, he found a number of skeletons that were obviously belonged to Native Americans, but one of the skeletons was larger and did not belong to Native Americans. They weren't quite sure what its racial origins were, but more importantly than that, under the skull of this anomalous skeleton was found a slate tablet, and the tablet was inscribed with a number of letters, a one-line inscription. Well, that was unusual in itself because the Native Americans did not have a written language. So the Smithsonian archaeologists thought, well, somebody must have broken into the mound at some later time and inserted this tablet under the skull of the Indian. Well, that's a ridiculous supposition. Nothing like that had ever been found before. Nobody can imagine why anybody would do such a thing. But the Smithsonian archaeologists didn't think much of it. And then when they published the picture of the Bat Creek stone, a cryptographer with the United States Navy by the name of Henrietta Mertz was intrigued enough because she felt that the Bat Creek stone inscription resembled Hebrew. She thought it might be Hebrew. So she showed it to Professor Cyrus Gordon at Brandeis College in New York. And he, at this time, this is the 1950s now, he was the world's leading scholar in Near Eastern ancient languages. He identified the Bat Creek stone at once as being a Hebrew inscription that read simply, "For Judea." And because of the language form, the letter form, he dated it to about 100 A.D. In other words, it's about 19 centuries old. Well, when he did that, the mainstream archaeologists said, it's a fraud, it's a hoax, Professor Gordon is a rogue scholar, not a Rhodes scholar, a rogue scholar. And it became a terrible controversy between those people who thought it was authentic and mainstream archaeologists who said it's fake or a misinterpretation of the evidence. And it wasn't until the year 2007, long after Henrietta Mertz and Professor Gordon were dead, that a geologist, a trained geologist by the name of Scott Walter, was given the Bat Creek stone to examine from a geological point of view. And he took it to his laboratory in St. Paul, Minnesota. The Bat Creek stone was subjected to state-of-the-art geological investigative equipment, specifically an electron microscope. And it was determined at this laboratory by Scott Walter that the inscription on the Bat Creek stone, because of its deposition and its mineralization, could have only have been inscribed about 2,000 years ago. It is not a modern inscription. So in other words, geology has trumped archaeology and has shown that the inscription is not a fake. It could have only been done, just as Cyrus Gordon said, about 19 centuries ago. And this is now hard, solid evidence that people from the Near East were in eastern Tennessee 19 centuries ago, and that man buried in the mound was in fact someone from the Near East, probably a Jew from Jerusalem, very possibly. And now there's an ongoing lawsuit between the Cherokee Indians, on whose land it was found, and the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian curators there, they still have the skeleton of the figure that was found in the mound, but they're not releasing it. And so there's strife now between the Cherokee and the Smithsonian. But in any respect, the Bat Creek stone is a legitimate artifact. There's no more discussion. But, that discovery was made in 2007. But did anybody read about it in the newspapers? Was it on the news? Have the textbooks been revised now because of this? No. It's just neglected. It's not discussed.
The equivalent of being swept under the rug.
It's just ignored to death.
Right.
And that it has joined a large collection of physical evidence, which is almost as good as that. And but it does show that geology and genetics and things like that, and these hard sciences are replacing this totally out-of-date pseudoscience called American archaeology.
Well, I think it's good that they're starting to update their techniques. But it's got about 15 minutes left in the show, and I didn't want to let you out of here without asking you about the Christians and what drew them over here, and roughly when were they pulled over here?
Well, the Christians came in various waves because the Christians fought amongst themselves terribly. And one Christian sect would massacre another. An example of that were the Coptic Christians. The Coptic Christians were what is known as Gnostics. They believed that a church or priests were not necessary for a direct experience of God. And that point of view got them the label of heretic, which was a very dangerous thing to do. And mainstream Vatican Catholics persecuted them to the point where they were being exterminated, literally liquidated. The same thing happened when another Gnostic group called the Knights Templar also struck away from mainstream Christianity. And it was during these terrible periods of interfaith strife that took place in medieval times that these groups found they had to either become boat people and risk a very dangerous voyage across the North Atlantic or remain in the old world and be exterminated. And that explains why we are able to find large evidence, extensive evidence of these heretical Christians in North America. The best example of that is something known as the Michigan Tablets. Something like 10,000, an amazing collection, 10,000 of these tablets, slate tablets, have been found from 1840 to about 1915. And have been collected, some of them at the University of Michigan, as a matter of fact, others in private collections. And these tablets are written in a kind of a Coptic-like script, and they portray mostly biblical scenes. And they belong to these people that escaped from Europe at a time when having the wrong belief would get you killed.
So they were refugees, so to speak. And they were
yes, they were very much refugees.
Okay, and they were starting out the whole new colony over here for the survival of their kind.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, Michigan was for them a true religious colony, and a large one. And the slate tablets, some of them are beautifully made. The illustrations, the artwork is always a little on the primitive side, but the geometry for the calendars and their writing tablets are really quite impressive, beveled stonework, and I've been lucky to see quite a few of the pieces from the Michigan tablets.
I read online, and again, you get all kinds of scuttlebutt online, but you get some good stuff too. Hard to say which is which if you don't have the background knowledge. But what I was reading was that this people from Scotland had actually came through America or sailed around America on the way to Canada to found Nova Scotia, a.k.a. New Scotland, and that they had actually stopped and made it with some of the Native Americans, kind of starting a set of half-breeds.
Yes, there are many indications of that, especially amongst the Native Americans themselves. The Native American mythic traditions are that these strangers or these foreigners came from across the sea, and most of the time the relations were quite good. It's only some of the more dramatic confrontations that are better remembered, unfortunately. But there were many peoples that traveled from Northern Europe to Canada. Especially I'm thinking about a people called the Red Paint people. They go back to about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The Red Paint people, also known as the Maritime Archaic, were builders of stone structures. Some of these structures had astronomical orientations, the same as the great megaliths of Northern Europe and Western Europe. And they call them the red paint people because they buried their dead, their honored dead, and when they did that, they put this red ochre over their body as a sign of life, regeneration. And the same practice was obtained in Denmark and in Scandinavia at the same time. Some of the artwork, especially some of the fish hooks, were made identically in Scandinavia and amongst the red paint people of Canada, the Maritime Archaic, at the same time as well. So the connections between those post-Ice Age peoples is beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I go into greater length than that in another book called Before Atlantis. But nonetheless, they were not colonized.
That's where I read that at. Was in your Before Atlantis book. You went into quite a bit of detail about it in that book.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the last of the maritime people to survive, they were called the Beothuk. And the Beothuk, among their last survivors before they died out, was this one lady. She had her portrait done, and her physical resemblance to Scandinavian is just unquestionable. She did not look very Native American at all. Very fair-complected, rosy lips, and light eyes. So she looked very Scandinavian, far more Scandinavian than Native American.
Okay. And that other stone you were talking about, Batwing Stone, wasn't that also mentioned in Before Atlantis?
No, I didn't discuss the Bat Creek Stone in Before Atlantis. I mentioned it. Yeah, I mentioned it briefly in a much earlier book called Discovering the Mysteries of Ancient America. But it's in the Lost Colonies of Ancient America where I talked about it at greater length.
I'm probably getting the books transposed on that one. I read an awful lot of books.
Well, bless your heart. I mean, it's hard. I can sympathize with you. It's very difficult to synthesize all this. It's a huge amount of evidence, and it covers thousands and thousands of years. So to try to put it into perspective is not all that easy. That's what I've tried to do, especially in the Lost Colonies of Ancient America. I've tried to put it into clear perspective. I've tried to make it as an easy read as possible, and I've hit only the highlights. I've taken not all of the evidence for overseas visitors to the Americas, but what I feel is the most persuasive evidence. And I think it makes a very strong argument for the Egyptians and the Romans and so forth who were here long before Columbus.
Well, we still got time. Is there anything you'd like to tell everybody that I didn't get a chance to cover?
Well, there's plenty, but one thing that they may be interested in if they want to learn more, there's going to be a conference held on August 16th in Cahokia, Illinois. That's right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. And this conference is going to discuss some of the things we've talked about here tonight. And if any listeners may be interested in attending this conference, they can dial this toll-free number. It's 877-494-0044. It's a toll-free number, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And at 877-494-0044, they can also order my book, The Lost Colonies of Ancient America. And if they mention that I've been on your show, Royce, I'd be glad to autograph it for them.
Fantastic. I hope you guys are making note of that in there and mention that you got it here. Now, we've got like 6 minutes remaining into the show. And I was going to mention to you, I've got your number here. I want to call you back again tomorrow, the next day, and I want to talk to you about maybe doing a 2-hour slot over at Revolution Radio. It's a big radio network that I'm a part of, and they got some 60-odd hosts over there and a huge live audience because of their huge network that I think a lot of them may be also interested in this material. And I say 2 hours because, they gave me a 2-hour slot, and if I don't fill it with somebody, I'll be out there babbling by myself.
Well, you babble very attractively, so that would be just fine.
Okay. Well, then I'm trying to think if there's anything else I didn't cover. Now, I'm pretty sure that if I asked you about the Knights Templar, most likely they came over for similar reasons to the Christians about the same time, if not a little bit after. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's correct. Well, of course, the Knights Templar were themselves very devout Christians. Again, they were Gnostics. The Knights Templar, they took their name from these early volunteers from France who wanted to fight in the Crusades for the establishment of the New Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time, of course, was under threat, had been actually overtaken by the forces of Islam, and that the Crusades were to liberate Jerusalem and to create what's called the New Jerusalem. What they meant by that, the New Jerusalem, was to get away from the Vatican and to create a new form, a new sect of Christianity that was closer to the original teachings of Jesus, or so they said. And the Knights Templar took their name from this and from the fact that their first headquarters in Jerusalem was on the Temple Mount. So henceforth they were known as the Knights Templars. And they assumed great power and popularity over time, so much so that by the 14th century, just after 1300 A.D., they were banned by the Catholic Church, and there was an attempt to exterminate them. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive at the stake as an example to the other Templars. The Templars had great wealth, as I say, and they also had a huge fleet. And this fleet vanished from France and popped up in Scotland. And there the Templars found an ally in the Sinclair family. And together with the Sinclair family, they came to America as refugees because the church was still persecuting the Templars and any resurgence of the Knights Templar. So they arrived here in North America, and one of the things they left behind was this great tower called the Newport Tower in Rhode Island. And that has been identified as a Templar construction and was kind of a temple, actually. It is oriented to the planet Venus and to other celestial phenomena, just the same as these 8 arch structures that are found in England. You can find the same structure is found in the Newport Tower is in Scandinavia and England. So that's only the beginning. That's hardly touched the surface when it comes to the Knight Templars' impact on the Americas. I go into far greater detail, the stones that they left behind. The Knights Templar made it as far as my own state, Minnesota. They left another runic stone not too far from the Knights Templars' Newport Tower. In Narragansett Bay, that's there. As a matter of fact, it's mostly underwater, which helps to establish its authenticity. Wonderful stuff. And the Knights Templar certainly were part of this great drama that belongs to all of us.
Well, the Knights Templar was also an offshoot of, if I understand correctly, the Freemasons who were once the stonemasons, and they were going around the world pretty much everywhere they went, building huge edifices and temples and cathedrals and everything else. So you couldn't miss their work and miss when they were around.
Well, that's a very controversial point that you mentioned, Royce, because some Knights Templars, they seem to be very much associated with this Freemasonry, but then there are Freemasons today who mostly believe that there's no connection whatsoever with the Knights Templar. So who's to say really what that connection is? I'm not a Freemason myself. I'm not familiar too much with that ideology or whatever you want to call it. So there might be some kind of, today's Freemasons might be the descendants of the Knights Templar. It's possible. I don't discount it, but I don't know enough about it to really say any more, unfortunately.
Right. And let's face it, you got different varying stories all over the internet about it. And for any one person to be able to say, this guy is correct, is really kind of hard to do.
Well, what I've tried to do in my book is I just don't repeat information that I hear on the internet. I've tried to get the most solid and most credible information. Most of my sources are from universities or from science periodicals. everything from National Geographic to the Lancet. So I said many universities and colleges that are doing some fabulous archaeological work on their own. That's the type of source material I'm mostly going for, not just New Age stuff or people that are saying something fantastic. The truth is fantastic enough without any elaboration, I think.
Right, I got you. All righty. Now, everybody, I want y'all to come back and see me tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central Time at www.freedomslips.com, which is my slot over at Revolution Radio, and that is a 2-hour slot. I'll be talking to Robert Foreman. The topic will be Enlightenment Ain't What It's Cracked Up to Be. And he already did a show over here, folks, that went splendidly, was very interested, and I invited him over there because I thought everybody over there would like to hear what he had to say. The same way I kind of feel the same way about Frank here. Matter of fact, I've always felt that way about Frank, but I just recently got on Revolution, so the times you're here in the past, I wasn't with him to ask you. One more time, though, just to remind y'all, his well, actually, you're not with Ancient American magazine anymore, are you?
Well, actually, I am. I still write for it, and if people are interested in my books, they can contact Ancient American at that number I gave, which is 877-494-0044. That is Ancient American, and they do carry my books.
And that's www.ancientamerican.com/AA. I was there the other day and got the link to put over here. Also, you can find his description of this show. It's going to be archived probably, I would say most likely by tomorrow, along with the description, the book description, his description, and the link to the book. And just come over here, click on podcasts at the top, and select his show from the list that you'll see on the page in front of you. With that, everybody, I want y'all to have a good night. I'll look forward to seeing you hopefully tomorrow. Don't forget to invite your friends. I want to thank you for coming. Couldn't have a show without my guests anymore. I could have one without I actually couldn't have one with my listeners anymore. I could have one without my guests. I kind of got that one reversed. And with that, I'm going to go meet with my wife and spend some time with her. You folks have a good night.